The night air was cold, much colder than it had been since he arrived. The stars were like ice in the black sky above. The moon was barely a sliver. He shivered as he pulled his coat tighter over his pajamas. He reached down to his pocket, making sure the key was still there. It was. He stepped off the porch. The main house was dark, as it should have been at this late hour. The children would be asleep in their beds. He barely made a sound as he walked toward the garden. For a man his size, he could be light on his feet when he needed to be. The air smelled of salt and felt heavy against his skin. He followed the path through the garden. He wondered what Helen would think when she came. He thought she'd be impressed. He hoped so. Talia deserved it. She worked hard. He rounded the back of the house. He stumbled over a thick root, but managed to stay upright. There in front of him was the cellar door. The scorch marks made a terrible amount of sense now. His throat clicked as he swallowed. He could, Linus knew, turn right around now and forget all about this. He could go back to his bed and for the next 6 days keep a professional distance and do what he'd been sent here to do. Then he would board the ferry for the last time, and a train would be waiting to take him home. The sunlight would fade behind dark clouds, and eventually it would start to rain. He knew that life. That was the life for a man like Linus. It was dreary and gray, but it was the life he'd led for many, many years. This last month, this bright flash of color would be nothing but a memory. He took the key from his pocket. It probably won't even fit the lock, he muttered. It's most likely been changed. It hadn't. The key slid into the rusted padlock perfectly. He turned it. The lock popped open, with the smallest of sounds. It fell to the weeds. Last chance, he told himself. Last chance to forget all this foolishness. The door was heavier than he'd expected, so much so that he could barely lift it. He grunted as he pulled it open, arms straining at the weight. It took him a moment to figure out why. Though the outside of the cellar doors were wooden, the inside was a sheet of thick metal as if it had been reinforced, and in the starlight he could see shallow grooves carved into the metal. He raised his hand and pressed his fingers against the grooves. There were 5 of them, close together, as if someone with small hands had scraped them from the inside. That caused a cold chill to run down Linus's spine. Before him, disappearing into a thick darkness, were a set of stone stairs. He took a moment to let his eyes adjust, wishing he'd remembered to bring a flashlight, or he could wait for daylight. He entered the cellar. Linus kept a hand pressed against the wall to keep his balance. The wall was made of smooth stone. He counted each step he took. It was at 13 when the stairs ended. He couldn't see a thing. He felt along the wall, hoping to find a light switch. He bumped into something, a bright snarl of pain rolling up his shin and into his thigh. He grimaced and felt for it. There, a switch. He flipped it up. A single bulb flared to life in the middle of the room. Linus blinked against the dull light. The cellar was smaller than he expected. The room in the guest house where he'd spent the last 3 weeks was bigger, though not by much. The walls and ceiling were made of stone, and almost every inch of them were covered in what appeared to be soot. He looked down at his hands and saw they were black. He rubbed his fingers together, and the soot fell away to the floor. He'd bumped his knee into a desk set against the wall near the light switch. It had been partially burned, the wood blackened and cracked. There was a twin bed, the metal frame broken. There was no mattress, though Linus supposed that made sense. It would be too easy to burn. Instead, there were thick tarps that Linus expected to be flame retardant. And that was it. That was everything in the cellar. Oh, no, he whispered. No, no, no. Something in the corner caught his eye. A single bulb in the room wasn't strong, and there were more shadows than not. He approached the far wall, and as he got closer, he felt his knees turn to jelly. Tick marks scratched into the wall. 4 lines in a row, crossed with a 5th. 5, he said. 10, 15, 20, 25. He stopped counting when he reached 60. It was too much for him to handle. He thought they were meant to keep track of days, and the idea caused his heart to ache. He swallowed past the lump in his throat. The unfairness of it all threatened to overwhelm him. Dikomi wasn't lying. The file had been true. I haven't been down there in years. I haven't been down here in years, a voice from behind him said. Linus closed his eyes. No, I don't expect you have. I thought you seemed a little off, Arthur said quietly. After you returned to us from the post office, something had changed. I didn't know what, but it had. I chose to believe you when you said you were tired, but then at dinner you looked as if you'd seen a ghost. I tried to hide it, Linus admitted. It didn't appear I did a very good job of it. Arthur chuckled, though it sounded sad. You're much more expressive than you think. It's one of the things I... No matter. That's neither here nor there, for a moment at least. Linus curled his hands into fists to keep them from shaking. So it's true then. What is? What I read in the file Dicomey sent me. I don't know. I've never read my file. For all I know, it's full of half-truths and outright lies. Or perhaps everything is correct. One can never tell with Dicomey. Linus turned around slowly as he opened his eyes. Arthur stood at the foot of the stairs. He was dressed for bed, meaning he wore his shorts and a thin t-shirt. Irrationally, Linus wanted to offer his coat. It was much too cold for Arthur to be out in what he was wearing. He didn't even have socks on or shoes. His feet looked strangely vulnerable. He was watching Linus, though there didn't appear to be any anger in his gaze. If anything, he looked slightly stricken, though Linus couldn't be sure. He gave you a key, Arthur said. It wasn't a question. Linus nodded. There was a key, yes. Wait, what do you mean he? Charles Werner. How do you know? He stopped and took a deep breath. But I made this house a home for those I had, and in preparation in case more came. Your predecessor, he changed. He was lovely, and I thought he was going to stay, but then he changed. What happened to him? He was promoted first to supervision, and then last I heard to extremely upper management, just like he always wanted. I learned a very harsh lesson then. Sometimes wishes should never be spoken aloud, as they won't come true. I'm sorry, Linus said rather helplessly. For what? Linus wasn't sure exactly. He shook his head. I don't know what he intended. Oh, I think I do. Arthur stepped away from the bottom of the stairs. He traced a finger over the burnt surface of the desk. I suspect he read something in your reports that caused him concern. That was his way of intervening. Why? Because that's who he is. People can present themselves as being one way, and once you're sure you know them, once you're sure you've found what you're looking for, they reveal themselves for who they really are. He used me, I think, to get him what he wanted, where he wanted. Arthur rubbed his hands together. I was younger then, enamored, foolish, though you wouldn't have been able to convince me. I thought it was love. I can see now it wasn't. He said this was an experiment, Linus blurted, to see if someone like you could... Arthur arched an eyebrow. Someone like me? You know what I mean. Then why can't you say it? Arthur's chest hitched. A magical creature? Yes. Perhaps the rarest of them all? So it would seem. Say it, please. Let me hear you say it. I want to hear it from you. You knew a phoenix then? I did. He was inquisitive. Many things happened to him, but he still kept his head held high. I often think about the man he became. Linus Baker said, You're a phoenix. I am, Arthur said simply. And I believe I'm the last of the kind. I never knew my parents. I've never met anyone else like me. Linus could hardly breathe. I couldn't control it, Arthur said, looking down at his hands. Not when I was a child. The master then wasn't someone I like to think about if I can help it. He was cruel and harsh, more likely to beat you than look at you. He hated us for what we were. I never knew why. Perhaps something had happened to him or his family before he came to this place. Or maybe he had just listened to the words of the people of the world and let it fill him like poison. Things were different then, if you can believe it. Worse for people like us. There are certain laws in place now that didn't exist back then that are meant to prevent, well, the village wasn't so bad, but it was only a tiny place in the big wide world. It was cherry ice cream from a pretty girl. It made me think that perhaps this island wasn't the be-all and end-all, and so I made a grave mistake. You asked for help. Arthur nodded. I sent a letter to Dicomey, or at least I tried to. I told them how horribly we were being treated, the abuse we suffered at the hands of this man. There were other children here, though he seemed to have a specific vendetta against me, and I took the brunt of it. But I was okay with that because the more he focused on me, the less he concerned himself with the others. But even I had a breaking point. I knew that if I didn't do something, and soon, I was going to hurt someone. The more you beat down a dog, the more it cowers when a hand is raised. If pushed hard enough, a dog might bite and snap, if only to protect itself. I thought I was being clever with my letter. I snuggled it out, folded into the top waistband of my pants, but somehow he found out about it while we were in the village. I snuck off, trying to make it to the post office, but he found me. He took the letter from me. Arthur looked away. That night was the first night I spent in here. I burned after that. I burned brightly. Linus thought he was going to be sick. That's not fair. He should have never been in a position to do that to you. He should have never been allowed to lay a hand on you. Oh, I know that now, but then I was a child. Arthur held out his hand, palm up. His fingers flexed slightly and fire bloomed like a flower. Linus, who had seen so many strange and wonderful things in his lifetime, was entranced. Back then, I thought it was what I deserved for being what I was. He beat that into me enough until I had no choice but to believe him. The fire began to move then, crawling up his wrist. It wound its way around his arm. When it reached his shirt, Linus was sure it would start to burn. It didn't. Instead, the fire grew until it began to snap and crackle. It rose in the air behind him, spreading out until Linus couldn't deny what he was seeing. Wings. Arthur Parnassus had wings of fire. They were beautiful. Linus could see burning feathers in the red and orange, and he remembered the night he'd seen the flash outside the guest house after Arthur had left. The wings stretched as much as they could in the small room, and Linus thought they were at least 10 feet long from tip to tip, and though he could feel the heat from them, it didn't feel scorching. The wings fluttered, leaving trails of golden fire. Above his head, Linus thought he could make out the outline of a bird's head, and the beak sharp and pointed. Arthur closed his hand. The phoenix curled back down toward the top of his head, wings folding in. The fire snuffed out, leaving thick wisps of smoke, the after images of a great bird dancing in Linus's eyes. I tried to burn my way out, Arthur whispered, but the master had prepared for that. The metal slats against the door, the walls made of stone. Stone, I learned, can withstand intense heat. It became obvious rather quickly I would choke on the smoke before I ever escaped, so I did the only thing I could. I stayed. He was smart. He himself never brought me food or changed the bucket I used as a toilet. He made one of the other children do it, knowing I would never harm them. Though Linus didn't want to know, he asked, "How long were you down here?" He couldn't bear to look at the tick marks scratched into the wall. Arthur looked pained. By the time I left, I had thought it had been a few weeks. It turned out to be 6 months. When you're constantly in the dark, time gets slippery. Linus hung his head. Eventually, someone came, either because they suspected something was off or because they decided an inspection was necessary. I was told the master tried to explain away my absence, but one of the other children was brave enough to speak up. I was found, and the orphanage was shut down. I was sent to one of Dicomy's schools, which was better, though not by much. At least there I could go outside and spread my wings. I don't understand, Linus admitted. Why would you ever return to this place after everything that happened to you? Arthur closed his eyes. Because this was my hell, and I couldn't allow it to stay that way. This house had never been a home, and I thought I could change that. When I went to Dicomy with the idea of reporting the Marsyas orphanage, I could see the greed in their eyes. Here they could keep track of me. Here they could send others who they thought were the most dangerous. They assigned Charles to me, telling me he would help get things in order. He did, but to his own end. Zoe tried to warn me, though I chose not to believe her. Anger swelled within Linus. And where was she? How in God's name did she not help you? He shrugged. She didn't know. She hid herself away, fearing reprisal. She was the great secret of this island, and one they would have tried to harness back then. I only met her once. Before I went into the cellar, I stumbled upon her in the woods, and she nearly killed me until she saw me for what I was. She fled instead. After I returned to the island, she came to me and told me she was sorry for all that I endured, that she would allow me to stay and that she would help if needed. That's not... She isn't to be blamed, Arthur said sharply as his eyes flashed open. I certainly don't. There was nothing she could have done that wouldn't have put herself in danger. They know about her now, Linus admitted. I included her in my report. We know. We made the decision after we received notice that Dicomie was sending a caseworker. She was tired of hiding. She accepted the risk because of how important the children are to her. She needed you to see that she wasn't going to let them go without a fight. Linus shook his head. I can't. Why on earth would Dicomie allow you this place at all? Why would they agree to put children in your care? He blanched and added quickly, You're quite capable, of course. It's just that guilt is a powerful tool, Arthur said. For all I endured here, it would fall back on Dicomie if word ever got out. They thought they could use it as leverage. For my silence, they would allow me this house. To keep track of me, yes, but in the end, they saw the island as a solitary and desolate place where the only village nearby could be easily bought off. One where they could send who they considered to be the most extreme. This was their grand experiment. They thought I was a pawn. But you were playing with them, Linus whispered. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Arthur smiled. Oh, yes, I took their huddled masses and gave them a house where they could breathe without fear of retaliation. His smile faded. I thought I had everything planned. And maybe I made mistakes. Keeping the children on the island, for one, that was born out of fear. I told myself they had enough, that the island and Zoe and I could provide everything they could ever need. I loved them more than anything in this world, and I convinced myself that love would be enough to sustain them. But I didn't account for one thing. What? Arthur looked at him. You were the most unexpected thing of all. Linus gaped at him. Me? But why? Because of who you are. I know you don't see it, Linus, but I see it enough for the both of us. You make me feel like I'm burning up from the inside out. Linus couldn't find a way to believe him. I'm just one person. I'm just me. I know, and what a lovely person you are. This couldn't be real. You played them, Dicomie, to get what you wanted. Arthur's eyes narrowed. Yes? Linus had to fight to get the words out. You could be doing the same to me, to get what you want, to have me say what you want in my reports. Linus sucked in a sharp breath. Oh, Linus, do you really think so little of me? I don't know what to think, Linus snapped. You're not who I thought you were. You lied to me. I withheld the truth, Arthur said gently. Is there a difference? I think. Do they know about you, the children? Arthur shook his head slowly. I learned rather quickly how to hide myself from most everyone. Why? Because I wanted them to think there was still good in the world. They were sent to me shattered into the tiniest of pieces. The less they knew about me, the better. They needed to focus on their own healing, and They could have found solidarity with you, Linus argued. They could have, and I was instructed by Dicomie never to reveal myself to them. Linus took a step back. He hit the wall. What? It was part of the deal, Arthur said. One of their conditions before they agreed to allow me to return here. I could reopen Marsyas, but who I am, what I am, would remain a secret. Why? You know why, Linus. Phoenixes are... I can burn brightly, and I don't know if there's a limit. I believe I could burn the very sky if I push myself hard enough. If they couldn't figure out a way to harness that power, then at the very least they'd put a muzzle on it. Fear and hatred comes from not being able to understand what... That's no excuse, Linus snapped. Just because you can do things others cannot doesn't make you something to be reviled. He shrugged awkwardly. It was their way of showing that, regardless of what I was getting in return, they still had a hold over me. It was a reminder that all of this could be taken away whenever they wanted. When Arthur left shortly after Talia and Fee arrived, he told me to remember that, and if he ever got word I had reneged on my promise, or that he even thought I had, he would send someone to investigate, and if need be, shut us down. I'm sure the thought crossed their mind at one point or another that instead of me living quietly on this island with their cast-offs, I would instead amass an army. Preposterous, of course. I never wanted anything more than a home I could call my own. It's not fair. No, it's not. Life rarely is. But we deal with it the best we can, and we allow ourselves to hope for the best, because a life without hope isn't a life lived at all. You have to tell them. They need to know who you are. Why? Because they have to see they aren't alone, Linus cried, slamming his palms back against the wall. That magic exists where we least expect it to, that they can grow up to be whoever they choose to be. Can they? Yes, and though it may not seem like it now, things can change. Talia said that you told her in order to change the minds of many, you have to first start with the minds of a few. He smiled. She said that? Yes. I didn't think she was even listening. Of course they listen, Linus said, exasperated. They listen to every single thing you say. They look to you because you are their family. You are their... He stopped, breathing heavily. He shouldn't say it. It wasn't right. None of this was. It wasn't... You are their father, Arthur. You said you love them more than life itself. You have to know they feel the same about you. Of course they do. How can they not? Look at you. Look at what you've made them. You are a fire, and they need to know how you burn, not only because of who you are, but because of what they have made you into. Arthur's expression stuttered and broke. He lowered his head. His shoulders shook. Linus wanted to console him, wanted to take Arthur in his arms and hold him tight, but he couldn't get his feet to move. He was confused, all his thoughts swirling in a storm in his head. He latched on to the only thing he could. And when I go back, when I leave this place, I will do my best to make sure extremely upper management knows this, that the island... Arthur's head snapped back. When you go back? Linus looked away. My time here was always going to be short. There was always an end date. And while it came much quicker than I anticipated, I have a home, a life, a job, one that is now more important than ever, I think. You have opened my eyes, Arthur, all of you. I will be forever grateful. Grateful, Arthur said dully. Of course. Forgive me. I don't know what I was thinking. Linus looked up to see him smile, though it seemed to tremble. Anything you can do to assist us will be more than wonderful. You are a good man, Linus Baker. I'm honored to have known you. We'll have to make sure your last week here on the island is one you'll never forget. He started to turn, but then paused. And I promise you the thought of using you for anything has never crossed my mind. You're too precious to put into words. I think it's like one of Theodore's buttons. If you asked him why he cared about them so, he would tell you it's because they exist at all. And then he was up the stairs and into the night. Linus stood in the shelter, staring at the space Arthur had left behind. The air was still warm, and Linus swore he could hear the crackling of fire. Chapter 16. If Linus's life were a drama, the last week of his stay on Marsyas would have been cold and rainy, the gray clouds shifting overhead to match his mood. But it was sunny, of course. The sky and the sea were cerulean. On Monday, Linus sat in on the children's classes, listening as they discussed the Magna Carta in the morning and the Canterbury Tales in the afternoon. Sal was quite vexed the stories were unfinished, which led Arthur to bring up the Mystery of Edwin Drood. Sal vowed to read it and come up with his own ending. Linus thought it would be marvelous and wondered if he could ever get to read it. On Tuesday, from the hours of 5 in the afternoon to 7, he sat with Talia in her garden. She was fretting slightly over what Helen would think when she visited next week. She worried that Helen wouldn't like what she'd grown. What if it's not good enough? Talia muttered in gnomish, and the fact that Linus understood her barely crossed his mind. I think you'll find that it's more than adequate, he replied. She scowled at him. More than adequate. Gee, Linus, thank you for that. I feel so much better already. He patted her on the top of the head. We do need to keep the ego in check. You have nothing to fear. She looked around her garden doubtfully. Really? Really. It's the most beautiful garden I've ever seen. She blushed under her beard. On Wednesday, he sat with Fee and Zoe in the woods. He'd forgone a tie, and his shirt was open at his throat. He was barefoot, the grass soft underneath his feet. Sunlight filtered through the trees, and Zoe was telling Fee that it wasn't just about what she could grow, but about cultivating what was already there. It's not always about creation, Zoe said quietly as flowers bloomed underneath her hands. It's about the love and care you put into the earth. It's intent. It'll know your intentions, and if they're good and pure, there's nothing you won't be able to do. That afternoon he was in Chauncey's room, and Chauncey was saying, "Welcome to the Everland Hotel, sir. May I take your luggage?" And Linus replied, "Thank you, my good man. That would be wonderful." He handed over an empty satchel. Chauncey hefted it over his shoulder, his bellhop cap sitting crooked on his head. After he made sure to tip Chauncey handsomely. It was what one did after having received first-rate service, after all. The salt water on the floor was warm. It was late afternoon on Wednesday, and Linus was starting to panic, a feeling settling over his shoulders like a heavy cloak that this wasn't right, that he was making a mistake. He put his luggage on his bed with the intention of beginning to pack. He was leaving the day after tomorrow, and he told himself he might as well get started, but he stood in his room staring down at this bag. His copy of the rules and regulations lay on the floor near the bed. He couldn't remember the last time he picked it up. He asked himself why it had been so important in the first place. He didn't know how much longer he would have stood there if he hadn't heard the tapping on the bedroom window. He looked up. Theodore was perched, wings folded at his sides, head cocked. He tapped his snout against the glass again. Linus went to the window, sliding it open. "Hello, Theodore." Theodore chattered in response, greeting Linus as he hopped inside. His wings opened, and he half jumped, half flew to the bed, landing near Calliope. His eyes narrowed at her, and he snapped his jaws. She stood slowly, arching her back as she stretched, and then she walked to Theodore and lifted her paw to smack him across the face before yawning and jumping down from the bed. Theodore shook his head, a little dazed. "You deserved that," Linus chided him gently. "I've told you not to antagonize her." Theodore grumbled at him. Then he chirped a question. Linus blinked. "Come with you? Where?" Theodore chirped again. "A surprise? I don't think I like surprises." Theodore wasn't having any of it. He flew up to Linus's shoulder, landing and nipping at Linus's ear until he had no choice but to obey. "Cheeky little git," Linus muttered. "You can't just bite until people do what you— Ow! I'm going!" The afternoon sun felt warm on Linus's face as they left the guest house. He listened as Theodore babbled in his ear, as the seagulls called overhead, as the waves crashed against the cliffs below. The ache in his heart was sharp and bittersweet. They entered the main house. It was quiet, which meant that either everyone was out doing their own thing, or Lucy was up to something terrible that would end in death. Theodore jumped down from Linus's shoulders, wings out as he landed on the ground. He stumbled over them as he hurried toward the couch, tumbling end over end. He landed on his back, blinking up at Linus. Linus fought a smile. "You'll grow into them yet. Quite a lot, I think." Linus turned over and found his footing. He shook himself from his head to the tip of his tail. He looked back up at Linus, chirped again, and disappeared under the couch. Linus stared after him, disbelieving what he'd just heard. He'd seen part of Theodore's hoard, the one he kept in the turret, but this was more important. Another chirp came out from underneath the couch. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. Theodore said he was sure. Linus slowly went to his hands and knees and crawled toward the couch. Obviously, he wouldn't be able to fit underneath, but he lifted up the skirt. If he lifted up the skirt, he'd be able to see just fine. So that was what he did. He lay flat on his stomach and peered underneath the couch into Theodore's lair, cheek pressed against the floor. Off to his right, there was a soft blanket that had been fashioned into a nest. A small pillow, the size of Linus's hand, sat atop it. Spread out around it were Theodore's treasures. There were coins and rocks shot with quartz, much like the ones in Lucy's room, and a pretty red and white shell with a crack through the middle. But that wasn't all. There was a piece of paper that Linus could make out a few words, brittle and thin, "I am held." There was a dried flower that looked like the ones Linus had seen in the garden. There was a leaf so green that only a sprite could have grown it. There was a piece of broken record. There was a picture that looked as if it had been torn from a magazine of a smiling bellhop helping a woman with her bags. There was a picture of Arthur as a younger man, the edges curled with age. And next to it, piled lovingly, were buttons. So many buttons. It's the little things I expect, little treasures we find without knowing their origin, and they come when we least expect them. It's beautiful when you think about it. Linus blinked against the sudden burn in his eyes. It's wonderful, he whispered. Theodore chirped that of course it was. He went to the buttons and nudged his nose into the pile as if searching for something. His tail thumped against the floor as he lifted his head. In his mouth was a familiar brass button. He turned and walked toward Linus. Linus watched as his jaw clenched. Theodore bit down onto the button before dropping it to the floor. Linus could see the impression of Theodore's fangs in the brass. Theodore nudged it toward him. He looked up at Linus and chirped. For me? Linus asked. You want me to take it? Theodore nodded. But that's... Linus sighed. It's yours. Theodore nudged it toward him again. Linus did the only thing he could. He took it. He sat up from the floor, pressing his back against the couch. He stared down at the button in his hand, tracing a finger over the grooves from Theodore's fangs. The wyvern poked his head out from underneath the couch and chirped up at him. Thank you, Linus said quietly. It's the nicest thing anyone has ever given me. I'll keep it for always. Theodore lay his head against Linus's thigh. They stayed there as the evening sunlight drifted along the wall. It was Thursday morning when the anger of men came to a head. Linus was in the kitchen with Zoe and Lucy, who was bellowing at the top of his lungs, along with Bobby Darin's sweet, sweet voice. Linus was smiling and he was laughing, though his heart felt like shards in his chest. Sticky buns were in the oven, and if he listened hard enough, though Lucy was doing his very best to make sure he couldn't, he could hear the sounds of the others moving through the house. So many leftover pecans, Zoe said. I'm not sure we needed to. Linus startled when she dropped the bowl she was washing back into the sink, soapy water splashing onto the floor. She stood stiffly. Her fingers twitched, her wings unfurling, moving hummingbird fast. Zoe? Linus asked. Are you all right? What happened? No, she whispered as Lucy continued to sing, unaware. No, not now. They can't. They can't. Lucy said, What? Who are you? Zoe turned around, a little soap bubble falling from her fingers and floating to the floor. Her eyes were brighter than Linus had ever seen before, filled with an otherworldly light, irises glittering like shattered glass. Not since Linus had known her had he been afraid of her, and this was still true, but he would be foolish to think she was anything but an old and powerful sprite, or forget that he was merely a guest on her island. He started toward her slowly, not wanting to surprise her in case she'd become unaware of his presence. Before he could reach her, Arthur burst into the kitchen, eyes narrowed. The room grew warmer, and for a moment Linus thought he saw the flash of fire. What is it? He demanded. What happened? The village, Zoe said, her voice soft and dreamy, her words almost like musical notes. They're gathering at the shore of the mainland. What? Lucy said. Why? Do they want to come here? He frowned down at the pecans on the countertop. They can't have my sticky buns. I made them just the way I like them. I know sharing is a nice thing to do, but I don't feel like being nice today. He looked at Linus. Do I have to share my sticky buns? Of course not, Linus said evenly. If that's what they want, they'll have to make their own. Lucy grinned, though it seemed nervous. I made 2 for you, Mr. Baker. I don't want you wasting away. Lucy, Arthur said, would you please gather the others in the classroom? It's almost time to begin your lessons. Lucy sighed. But, Lucy, he grumbled under his breath as he hopped down from his stool. He paused at the kitchen doorway, glancing back at the 3 of them. Is something wrong? Of course not, Arthur said. Everything is perfectly fine. If you please, Lucy. He hesitated only a moment longer before leaving the kitchen, calling for the others, telling them that apparently sticky buns wouldn't get them out of their lessons as he thought they would. Arthur went to Zoe, gripping her by the shoulders. Her eyes cleared and she blinked rapidly. You felt it too? Arthur nodded. Have they started to cross? No, they're stopped at the docks. I don't know why, but the ferry hasn't left the village. His voice hardened. They would be foolish to try. A chill arced down Linus's spine. Who? I don't know, she said, but there are a few of them. She looked past Arthur into nothing. They're angry. It's like a storm. Arthur dropped his hands and took a step back. You will stay here with the children. Go on as normal. Tell them nothing is amiss. I'll deal with this myself. I'll return as soon as I'm able. She reached for him, hands circling his wrist. You shouldn't have to do this, Arthur. Not after what... Let me go. I will... Arthur backed away from her slowly. No. On the chance they still come to the island, the children will need you more. You can protect them better than I could. If it comes down to it, take them to your house. Close the forest behind you so that nothing gets through. Cover the whole island if you have to. We've talked about this, Zoe. We always knew this was a possibility. She looked as if she were about to argue, but subsided at the expression on Arthur's face. I don't want you going alone. He won't be, Linus said. They turned to him in surprise, as if they'd forgotten he was there at all. He sucked in his stomach and puffed out his chest, hands on his hips. I don't know what's going on exactly, but I have a good idea, and if it has anything to do with the people in the village, then it's high time I gave them a piece of my mind. He thought he probably looked ridiculous, and his words didn't have the weight to them he'd hoped, but he didn't break their gazes. Arthur said, I won't have you in danger, Linus. It would be best if you... I can handle myself, Linus said with a sniff. I may not look like much, but I assure you I'm more than I appear. I can be quite stern when I need to be. And I'm a representative of the government. In my experience, people listen to authority. This was only somewhat true, but Linus kept that little detail to himself. Arthur sagged. You silly, brave man. I know what you are, but if you would just... Then it's settled, Linus said. Let's go. I don't like cold, sticky buns, so the sooner we deal with this and can return, the better. He started for the doorway, but stopped when a thought crossed his mind. How are we to cross if the ferry is on the other side? Catch. He turned in time to see Zoe toss a set of keys toward him. He fumbled with them, but managed to keep them from falling to the floor. He frowned when he saw it was the keys to her ridiculous car. While I appreciate the effort, I don't see how this will help us. This is quite a bit of water between us and the village, and unless your car is submersible, then I don't know how this will be of any use. It's better that if I don't tell you, she said. It'll only make you worry. Oh dear, Linus said faintly. I don't know if I like the sound of that. She stood on her tiptoes, kissing Arthur on the cheek. If they see you, Arthur shook his head, then they do. It's time to step from the shadows and into the light. Past time, I think. He glanced at Linus. Someone wise taught me that. They left, her standing in the sunlit kitchen, sticky buns warming in the oven. The car bounced down the road, Linus's foot pressing as hard as the gas pedal as he dared. His heart was racing, and his mouth was dry, but there was a sharp clarity to his vision. The trees seemed greener, the flowers that lined the road more brilliant. He glanced in the side mirror in time to see the forest closing off behind them with a low groan, covering the road with thick branches. If one didn't know what to look for, there appeared to be no way through. Arthur sat in the passenger seat, hands folded in his lap. His eyes were closed. He was breathing slowly in through his nose and out through his mouth. They reached the dock at the edge of the island without incident. The sea was calm, the white-capped waves small as they fell upon the shore. In the distance, across the channel, Linus could see the ferry still docked at the village. He brought the car to a stop, the brakes squeaking. Arthur opened his eyes. What now? Arthur asked nervously, sweaty hands flexing on the steering wheel. Unless this car is a submersible, I don't see how we can cross. And if it is, I must tell you I have no experience piloting such a vehicle and will most likely drown at the bottom of the sea. Arthur chuckled. I don't think we'll have to worry about that. Do you trust me? Yes, Linus said. Of course I do. How could I not? Arthur looked over at him. Then drive, my dear Linus. Drive and see what that trust has gotten you. Linus looked ahead through the windshield. He took a deep breath. He lifted his foot off the brake. The car began to roll forward. He pressed his foot down on the gas. The car picked up speed. His knuckles turned white as they left the last bit of road and hit the white sand of the beach. His throat closed as the ocean filled the windshield. Arthur, Arthur said, have faith. I would never let anything happen to you. He reached over and put his hand on Linus's leg, squeezing tightly. Linus didn't slow. He didn't stop. The roar of the ocean filled his ears as the dry sand turned wet and the first spray of salt water misted against his face. Before he could shout in warning, the sea crackled in front of them, the water vibrating and shifting as if something just underneath the surface was rising. He closed his eyes tightly, sure they were about to have wave after wave rush over them, pulling them under. The car rattled around them, the steering wheel jerking in his hand. He prayed to whoever was listening for guidance. "Open your eyes," Arthur whispered. "I would really rather not," he said through gritted teeth. Staring death in the face is vastly overrated. "Good thing we're not dying then. At least not today." Linus opened his eyes. He was stunned when he saw they were on the sea. He twisted his head to look back, only to see the shore shrinking behind them. He gasped, struggling to breathe. What on earth? He turned forward again. A white crystalline road lay before them, materializing from the ocean. He peered over the side of his door, looking down. The road beneath them was almost double the width of the car, snapping and crackling, but holding. "Salt," Arthur said, and Linus could hear the amusement in his voice. "It's the salt from the ocean. It'll hold." "How is this possible?" Linus said in wonder. Then, "Zoe." Arthur nodded. "She's capable of a great many things, more than I even know. I've only ever seen her do this once before. We decided long ago to make use of the ferry to keep the people of the village at ease. It's better to deal with Merle when we have to, instead of inciting fear by a car crossing the water." Linus choked on a hysterical laugh. "Oh, of course. Just a road made from the salt of the ocean. Why didn't I think of that?" "You didn't know it was a possibility," Arthur said quietly. "But those of us who dream of impossible things know just how far we can go when pushed to do so." "Well then," Linus said faintly, "let's see how they like us being pushed, shall we?" He pressed the gas pedal as hard as he could. The car roared forward along the salt road.